Hi, this is Mental Health and Human Rights Info in Oslo. My name is Dr. Doris Drews. I'm a senior psychiatrist in Oslo. Myself, I'm working with traumatized clients lots of years, and just now I'm the head of an acute crisis team at an outpatient psychiatric ward in Oslo. I'm affiliated with Mental Health and Human Rights Info in lots of years, and we have underwent lots of presentations for helpers as well as traumatized clients. Today we would like to present a session about trauma, about the effects of trauma, and what to do with the reactions in the aftermath, both for the helpers and the survivors. These are our topics for today. I would like to present human rights and mental health information in short, the manual we have underwent some years ago, and we would like to present some knowledge of trauma and trauma reactions. These knowledge can be used to help the survivors and help the helpers. We will talk about stabilization techniques and some grounding exercises. These are some key points about mental health and human rights info. We have a resource database, we are net-based, and we are providing free information about consequences of human rights violations on mental health in contexts of disaster, conflict and war. We are sharing the information on the website in English and in Spanish. We have lots of thematic pages with selected topics. And during the last years, we have developed some training manuals about gender-based violence in war and conflict. We have a training manual with focus on women in war and conflict, which is some years old. And recently we have developed and finished a similar manual, which is addressing conflict, war, trauma reactions for boys and men. We also have we think a quite important page for you as a survivor, where you can get some help and some advice. These are some key points about the manual focusing on women, gender-based violence in war and conflict, how it could be used, how you as a survivor and you as a helper might use that. We have developed this manual with some pilots we have underwent in lots of different countries. We have been in Jordan, in Cambodia, we have been in Turkey, Colombia and Norway. So this manual we have tried it out in lots of different contexts. We have a left side and a right side in the manual that might seem a little bit odd, but one side we try to address the survivor, the group of helpers we try to teach. And on the other side, we have kind of advices for the people controlling and leading the session with the helpers. These are just some key points, some core elements of the manual. We try to have a human rights-based approach, because gender-based violence can, of course, be seen as a human rights violation. The manual tries, and I hope we were succeeding with that, tries to be gender sensitive. We focus in that on mental health and trauma and the connotation between the both. We try to be psychoeducative. We try to educate the people about that. We are using therapeutic metaphors. We are addressing both the needs of the survivors and the helpers. And we try to teach how to cope with the reactions of trauma in the aftermath. We have tried the manual in lots of different contexts, also in cultural different settings. So this manual, we think it's quite cultural sensitive, and we can adapt it to lots of backgrounds, not only European, but for example, African, Asian, Arab. It's applicable on lots of backgrounds. Our goal is helping the survivors and the witnesses of disaster and upsetting events. That is quite important, we think, because people surviving catastrophes will often show explicit reactions that might seem quite strange, and these reactions are not adequate to the situation. You might see a survivor reacting very weird, maybe is upset in some situations which are not upsetting for us with not these strange backgrounds. As a helper, we are going in these situations, we will meet the survivors, and we might run the risk of misinterpreting the signs and the reactions of the survivor. We might see an outburst of irritation or anger, which is not adequate in the situation here and now. And it's quite necessary to know why a survivor is reacting in that way. Because otherwise, that may lead to us not initiating effective measures. When we don't know why the survivor is reacting in that way, we might take measures not adequate, not helpful in the end. So this behavior from us, from the helpers, not adequate to the survivors, this can in turn lead to a deterioration of the psychological balance of the survivor. And that can have far-reaching consequences in the time to come. The survivors might get sick, might get unbalanced, and might get in a chronic state of unbalance. When talking about helpers, we all have a picture in our mind, I think, what a helper is, what a helper can do, and we all want to be good helpers. Because a good helper can fix anything. Really? This little picture here will give you an impression, a result of lots of maybe interviews and group works with our manual some years ago, because that is a picture of the perfect helper. You see here a little tiny person, and she or he has a crown to protect and keep the helper secure. This helper has big, huge ears and can listen carefully, collect all the necessary information. The helper has also a big bag, and there you can put in the bag all of the problems and carry it away. The feet are standing on the ground, and you see the feet are very big, so it's a solid ground standing on, and the helper is stable. You have a small nose because a helper is sometimes in environments which are very stinky and very smelly, and you don't like to be disturbed by that. A thing we think are a little bit funny in a way, you also have a big bladder because you can't go to the toilet once in a while when a survivor is telling a very bad story. You can't just raise yourself and go out. This little picture has been drawn after lots of talks with helpers and survivors, and this is the ideal picture of a helper. We all would like to be this helper, but is it possible? The conclusion is it's a perfect helper, and a perfect helper doesn't exist. We are all human beings, and we are all getting affected by ourselves with all the atrocities and histories we are collecting during the helping the survivors. So a good helper do need help too, because not everything in the world, not the atrocities, can be fixed. As a helper, we are listening to clients. They are sharing stories about violence and abuse, and it's not easy to listen. It might be challenging to the helper in terms of how to face the client's powerlessness, the helplessness, and the frustration. The helper might just feel the same as the survivor, and the helper is getting torn apart. This is quite a good citation, we think, of Charles R. Figley, lots of connections with psychology and refugees. And he was quoting already 25, 30 years ago. I quote, "There's a cost to caring. Professionals who listen to clients' stories of fear, pain and suffering may feel similar fear, pain and suffering because they care. Sometimes we feel we are losing our own sense of self to the clients we serve." We try in this webinar with these slides to transport some information how you can have a double benefit with all the things I will also widen in the information afterwards, because everything we can help the survivors with will also help the helpers to stay in balance. And as a helper, we also need to be balanced. Both the knowledge about traumatization and the techniques to cope with the reactions in the aftermath are essential. So, what can we do to help? As a helper, you have to understand first the reactions of the survivors. You have to understand that yourself. So you have to have the knowledge what's going on. You have at least a little bit to know why is the survivor reacting maybe in a strange way. What is the connection between the atrocities they have survived and their reaction in the here and now? When you as a helper have kind of information about that and you know a little bit by yourself, then you can explain the reactions to the survivors. You can explain to them why they are reacting maybe strange or weird. So you try to normalize the reactions by teaching the survivors, oh, you have normal reactions. Bad things had happened, but you are reacting quite normal under these circumstances. We use, for example, metaphors as the butterfly woman. You will find the metaphor of the butterfly woman very explicit in our manual on gender-based violence. But we use also something called the window of tolerance, the window of learning. I will talk about that a little bit later. And afterwards, when you have taught the survivors about all that and you have a little bit of knowledge by yourself, then you can try to calm them down with so-called grounding exercises, working through the body, teaching these techniques to the survivor and maybe to you as a helper. And you can, of course, use the same techniques to calm yourself down. Hi again, here is Human Rights and Mental Health from Oslo again, and I will continue with my presentation about human health and the aftermath of atrocities and the impact on survivors. In the first part, I have emphasized the knowledge all of us as helpers is good to have when we are meeting survivors. So knowledge is the key point. And I would like here to have some key points why it's important to discuss PTSD. PTSD stands for post-traumatic stress disorder. That means it's a kind of disorder lots of people will develop after atrocities, after they survived life-threatening impacts. And traumatizing events, that means events that are able to traumatize us, they don't happen as rarely as we would like them to. Here are some key points, how often we will meet these disorders maybe in daily life, in our work. Around the world you have a little bit depending of different studies, some 1 to 9% PTSD so-called prevalence. That means 1 up to 9% of all human beings will suffer from PTSD during their lifespan. The next line is quite interesting because here you see some different numbers. Algeria, you have 37% PTSD prevalence during the lifetime. Cambodia, 28%, Ethiopia, 16%, Gaza, Palestine, 18%. All common for these countries, for these names, they are war zones, or at least there are lots of conflicts with weapons, with violence. And therefore, of course, you have already a connection between violence and war and the suffering of PTSD in the aftermath of that. When someone survives rape, it's a very good chance to develop PTSD. 50 to up to 90%. It's again very dependent where you are living and what kind of rape you are suffering through. It's a very good chance that you get PTSD in the aftermath of a rape. War, torture, internally displacement, 50% of all the people in general after the studies will develop a PTSD. And here you have already the connection to the topic before, rape. Rape is sadly often used in war as a weapon, so you have sometimes doubling the numbers here as well. Also, a violent or a severe traffic accident is very likely that you might develop a PTSD. Other violent crimes, 25%. And if you just see to the general numbers, so have about 7 million people died between 1961 and 1991 of natural disasters. Here you have disasters as tsunami or flood waves or volcanoes or something like that. In the 1980s, you had some wars, quite severe in Iraq and Afghanistan, and there more than 200,000 people had died each year globally in wars and in conflicts. In 2019 and 2020, the numbers went down. Luckily, only 50,000 per annum died in war and conflicts. But sadly, the last developments around the globe has maybe are going to rise the numbers again. You find these numbers and lots of other interesting stuff on the website ourworldanddata.org. Now, what is a traumatizing event? A traumatizing event is an event which could cause PTSD or trauma-related disorders. Trauma, the word means wound. It's coming from Greek, and both in medicine and psychology, it refers to major physical or mentally injuries, including threats of life or physical integrity. There is a quite known US-American psychologist with the name of Judith Herman, and she already in 1992 has phrased that trauma is a personal encounter with death and violence. And we think that it's a very good description for that. When you are in a traumatizing event, when you are suffering these atrocities, human beings are going into survival mode. Maybe you all heard already the phrases fight, flight, freeze. This is behaviorally expressions for these survival modes. You can also count together submission or playing dead. These are just some example pictures of possibly traumatizing events. You see here some pictures from war zones, but you also see a picture of a woman obviously beaten up. You see the picture of a prison cell, and you see the picture of a demonstration. So possible traumatizing events could be all of that. Maybe also flooding on tsunami. We don't have a picture here. Human beings, since the Stone Age, have developed survival strategies to cope with possibly life-threatening events. And we have some key points here. You have the fight reaction, you have the flight reaction, and you have a reaction which we can summarize with freeze, play dead, submit. All these strategies are in a way programmed in our cells, in our body, in our selves, and these are survival strategies. PTSD. What are we calling PTSD? Post-traumatic stress disorder. This slide here just shows a summarization of the key points of the internationally common description and definition of PTSD. Post-traumatic stress disorder can arise, I quote, as a delayed or protected response to a stressful event or situation of either brief or long duration of an exceptionally threatening or catastrophic nature, which is likely to cause pervasive distress in almost everyone. Here you have already a very good emphasis on which can cause distress in almost everyone. So the event that is necessary to cause these reactions are potentially changing the lives and the behaviors of all of us. So that means that the survivors neither are weak persons that can't cope with these atrocities. Also, we as a helper may be living through these situations, so the survivors are telling us we might have developed all the same reactions. The typical features of post-traumatic stress disorder are episodes, I quote again, of repeated reliving of the trauma in intrusive memories. These are called flashbacks. That might be dreams or nightmares, occurring against the persisting background of a sense of numbness, emotional blurring, blunting, detachment from other people, unresponsiveness to surroundings, anhedonia, avoidance of activities. The next topic is quite interesting. Why all these symptoms, and why are these symptoms coming more or less long after the incident itself? That has something to do with our bodies, with our brains, and how the brain is working. When a catastrophe is happening, it is happening very fast, often too fast to process that properly. And the reactions we will go into are also very fast to secure survival. You can think of your hand going on a very hot plate on your stove. If you are touching the plate and you have to think consciously, oh, that's hot, I have to retreat my hand, then it's burned already. So in this case, some reflexes are setting in. You just will pull your hand back before you're getting blisters. And that's not on a conscious level, that's unconsciously, it's a reflex. So these trauma reactions, these stress reactions are very fast. You don't think about that, it's happening. And after this incident, the connection between the incident and the reaction can be blocked. It's too fast that the brain can't cope with it. It's stored somewhere in your brain, and sometimes you can't recall it because it's in a kind of intermediate storage room in your brain. So the incident itself is not traumatizing, but all the emotions arising under this catastrophic event are neither edited nor integrated. This is a list of the normal survival responses, the reactions we might see in a trauma survivor. In red, you see some of the important key points. You might see intrusions. Intrusions is meaning recurring invading memories during the daytime. That might be flashbacks. You see the incidents you have survived as a film, as a movie in your head. And I had a client, he told me he had lost the control for the TV in his head. You can't stop them. Or you might have nightmares, bad dreams that could be of the incident that had happened, or that might be something similar, but it's very awful and stressful. One also might develop avoidance. One tries, of course, to avoid everything reminding the trauma. One has a kind of amnesia and feeling very numb. Hyperarousal is also very often seen sign and symptoms. These hyperarousal might look like anxiety, like panic. It's an increased irritation, restlessness. One has difficulties to concentrate, and the sleep is disturbed. All over, there's a very large portion of the survivor that can't emotionally regulate themselves neither. So there's a sudden explosive anger, a depression, they might get suicidal, they are very desperate. Very often we see also in survivors that they have a kind of change of consciousness. They might have forgotten the trauma. They might feel detached from the body, like in a dream. And very often we see in survivors a change of self-experience. They might feel ashamed that they didn't fight back. They might feel guilt that they couldn't fight back. They might feel guilt that they couldn't flee. Here again, some of the key points I already have mentioned just now. Some very big problems we see by these things. One of the key words, the sleeping problems, I would emphasize here especially because everything else is not balanced, so the sleeping problems getting more important in this connection. A common reason for sleeping problems might be, for example, nightmares. The survivor might fear the nightmares and therefore stays up all the night. This again might lead to a reversed day and night rhythm. And also during the days, the survivor might survive lots of emotional turmoils, and therefore this alone would disturb the sleep. One may also sleep because one is exhausted, and therefore sleeping during the day. That might disrupt the night sleep. And in the evening, very often the worries are coming back and holding back the sleep, and so on. It's a vicious circle. Back to knowledge about what is going on. This is just a short slide about the normal information processing and how PTSD does some malfunctioning of the brain. You have lots of areas in the brain responsible for normal daily tasks, and these atrocities, these memories, these PTSD symptoms will disturb in a way the functioning of the brain. So you have some areas, for example, right in front of your brain, and this part normally is responsible for normal behavior, that you are polite, that you can stop yourself, that you can reason with something. And PTSD and all the bodily symptoms and disturbances might affect this part of the brain, and that means that the survivor is dysregulated and just irritated and just blundering out. Some short points, what happens in the body. I will not go into details, but it's quite important to take here at home lesson in a way that PTSD and all the symptoms in the body afterwards is affecting really the body. It's not just in your mind. You are getting flooded with stress hormones which will begin a very flood with emotions, with irritations, with being able to fight and flight. And to be able to fight and flight from a dangerous situation, you have to motivate your body in a way to do that. So the body is reacting as well with lots of different things. This picture here is quite important, and we think also central in understanding what is going on with the survivor and maybe also with us as a helper. That's the metaphor of an unbalanced, balanced state called the window of tolerance. You are seeing these two lines. Normally all human beings are somewhere between these lines when we are balanced. We might be a little bit up, we might be a little bit down when we are irritated or sleepy, but we are within the lines. Trauma survivors have a tendency to go out of this window of tolerance. They might be hyper-aroused, then they are over the upper line, or hypo-aroused, then they are under the underline, under the downline. And that is also connecting with lots of symptoms, lots of signs we see in the survivors. When you are over the upper line, then the emotional reactivity is through the roof and you are hyper-vigilant and you might have intrusions, everything that it's in a way you are able to fight, but you can't think anymore rationally. Under the lower line, you are hypo-aroused, you have a flat affect, you are maybe almost asleep, you are collapsing, and then you can't think properly either. It's a very central question arising here now. What are we being thrown out of the window by? And now we have to talk about triggers. Triggers are trauma reminders, events or situations that remind victimized persons of their painful experiences and memories. Such reminders may provoke the same trauma reactions as when it happened. And that's very important. A trigger is a triggering factor in your daily life, might convince your body and your soul it's happening again. These reactions in itself can be extremely distressing and create such anxiety that people might get afraid and they don't want to go out anymore, they don't want to see other people, they are hearing certain sounds or do many ordinary usual things, they avoid all of these things. And it's very difficult, sometimes not possible, to be aware that triggers are connecting to events in the past, not to some current danger. And the people will see all these reactions as if it happens again. Some note on triggers. It's very important to have in mind not everything is difficult, not everything in the life outside of your four walls is difficult. And when you have learned to cope with certain situations, that means that you already can deal with certain triggers. Sometimes the same situation will cause a strong reaction and some other times not. And it's also very important to have in mind your vulnerability as a survivor or as a helper depends very much on your actual state in the moment. When you are tired, when you are afraid, when you are sleepy, then you cannot control these reactions to begin with. But it's not your fault. Dealing with triggers, of course, it's very important. Of course, one can try to avoid all triggers, but then they will get probably only more intrusive and more strong. The most important part of coping with triggers might therefore be identify them. Just find out what kind of trigger is getting you in a trauma reaction mode, what is activating you, what is getting you into hyper-arousal or hypo-arousal. Means identifying the triggers and become familiar with them. And it's also very important that you are getting familiar with your own reactions to the triggers. Nevertheless, it may sometimes be necessary to prevent or limit exposure to triggers in order to be able to deal with everyday life. And that's a very fine line in the sand against avoidance, because one should not avoid for anywhere price to get in contact with triggers. You have to expose yourself a little bit against these triggers to cope with them afterwards. So it's very interesting. You have to be creative, finding out what triggers you, how can you deal with it, can you avoid a little bit but not too much, can you foresee the triggers, can you foresee the reactions you are seeing there. And if the survivor is being triggered too much, what happens then? That means the survivor is no longer within the window of tolerance. You remember, upper line, down, lower line, and you have to be in between. And when you are not within the window of tolerance, then coping, understanding, and at least learning doesn't work anymore. So our goal with all these explanations and all the talk, in a way, is we like to get the person back into the window of tolerance by using stabilization. This is Mental Health and Human Rights Info again, and I would like to continue kind of with part 3 of my presentation about trauma and trauma reaction and how to cope with that in the aftermath of war, conflict and atrocities. I would like now to talk about techniques to cope. My second part was describing the ground key points, what is trauma and what kind of reactions we might see in survivors. And now I will talk a little bit about how to cope with these reactions. And it's also quite important to have in mind that now you as a helper might see all this we have talked before in the survivor. But how are you feeling? Do you as a helper have to cope with that as well? Here's a short list, or maybe not so short as well, where you might try to find yourself. Do you recognize yourself in this list? These might be reactions and signs you could see in yourself as a helper after a prolonged stressful time where you have met survivors, where you have been stressed by yourself. So a helper, you as a helper, would maybe get some wounded ideals that mean you had the impression you can help everyone, you can help in every possible situation, and this ideal of the helper as a almost perfect person managing everything that has been a little bit broken. Maybe the helpers would get a little bit cynic in their worldview. Maybe they or you as a helper would feel unappreciated. The spirit is going down when you are helping too much, too long, you don't have rest by yourself. Or maybe you're thinking you could fix anything, you are the perfect helper. That's also a kind of grandiose belief, not very realistic. Sometimes helpers have the tendency to neglect afterwards their own safety because the bomb alarms are continuously going and you don't go to the shelter after some days of this sirens anymore by yourself. You think, no, it will not happen anything, it's okay to stay here. Maybe you're getting a little bit isolated and you don't talk to your colleagues anymore, you're getting very tired, your concentration level is going down and you're getting sleeping disorders or at least sleeping difficulties. And some of the helpers, very disillusioned and very frustrated, may tend to use a little bit more alcohol or drugs than it might be okay. Here are some key points about that we are calling the vicarious trauma toolkit model. Vicarious trauma is a work-related trauma exposure. Here is a little bit difference or difficult to see the two definitions of trauma. Trauma for a survivor means an event which has life-threatening aspects. As a helper, you rarely are in a situation where you are by yourself in your situation where maybe you are getting injured or getting hurt. You are hearing histories of atrocities, but you don't live through them as by yourself. Anyhow, it's called vicarious trauma because it's doing something with you as a helper as well. These vicarious traumas have lots of different responses, and you see that in the slides. That might be negative responses. You are getting, as a helper, traumatized. You are getting affected by yourself. You might get this symptom range we are calling compassion fatigue. You are getting very tired and very numb by hearing so many difficult stories. But maybe you can also get resilient. You can get some positive aspects from these helping roles. You can get activated and you can get very compassionate and very satisfied by the work you are doing. We try to stabilize the trauma reactions. I was into that topic in the second part of my talk. Now, some remarks about what do we really mean by stabilization. Stabilization means that we try help to cope with trauma-related reactions. We try to improve the ability to be present. Because I hope you remember from the last part, from part number 2, that trauma reactions getting triggered by reminders, by trauma reminders, means that the survivor will feel reactions as if it happens again. And that means that the survivor is in a way back in the past, back in the situation when he or she got traumatized. So stabilization means also help to be present, to come back to the here and now. Stabilization describes also techniques or therapeutic actions which helps a survivor react to in a more normal way to stress factors. Means that you don't get very angry on a bagatelle, that you don't get very irritated by things for other persons. It's okay, it's not so easy to cope with, but it's not so easy, not a big deal, but a trauma survivor might react very heavily on that. Stabilization means also education about trauma and its effects, understanding better your own stress response. We call it psychoeducation. And this psychoeducation was mainly part 2 of my talk today, where I tried to teach some of the core principles of what does traumatic events do with your body, with yourself, with your brain. At the same time, you need to know about coping strategies that can provide a sense of control. Control is also a very, very important key point here, because lots of survivors, they don't feel in control. When some very difficult things are happening, maybe lots of things are in place, but the survivor has not control over the situation. And it's a very imprinted core point of human existence and being. We would like to be in control. And if you are living through situations where you don't have control, it's really, really frightening. These stabilization techniques should also help the survivor, maybe the helper, to get back in control as far as that is possible. It is very important that the survivor is in the present, in the here and now. Then you can work with the past. So you have to be in the window of tolerance, you have to be in the here and now. Then you can learn new strategies, then you can understand, and then you can cope. So that means the survivor has to be stable, hence stabilized, before one can start or continue talking. Therefore, we use, for example, grounding exercises. Grounding is a kind of stabilization method for handling strong emotions. After being triggered, when a memory takes over, then it is as if it happens again. And grounding is very important to get, again, the survivor back into the here and now. Grounding techniques are mostly done by exercises with the body, because remember, in the knowledge part of the talk, I have talked lots about the bodily reactions which trauma survivors are expressing. So you can teach them to see the trauma reactions in the body, and by calming down the body, you can also calm down the mind, and you are coming back to the here and now. These techniques, we will try to help the survivor, therefore, to connect again with the present moment, with the present time, with the here and now, and with the body. We have here some tips and tricks how to do these exercises, how to do the stabilization. And we are talking here about so-called focus areas. That's nothing else than a little bit to scan your body. To scan your body, how are you doing? What is, for example, your breathing doing? Is your breathing just now light or fast, shallow? Are you holding your breath? What are your thoughts like just now? Are you ruminating? Are you worrying about something? Or are you just blanking out and don't think of anything at all? Do you see some feelings? Do you fear something? Do you see some anxiety in your body? Do you feel sad? What is your heart doing? Here are we again back into the body. Is your heart beating fast? Is your heart beating slow? Is your heart beating up in your throat? Lots of clients are talking about the heartbeat. Oh, it's just jumping out of my throat when I'm anxious, when I'm in panic. And last but not least, your body as a whole system. Do you have some pain somewhere in your body? Are your muscles aching? Are you tense? Do you have headaches? These are, as mentioned, the focus areas. You can scan together with the survivor, the body of the survivor, to be aware how is your body now. And then you can use also the window of tolerance to just range yourself, or the survivor, that he or she can range herself in the window of tolerance. For example, the body is very tense, the muscles are aching, one is very worried, the breathing is very shallow and fast, then you can maybe see that the survivor is over the upper line in the window of tolerance. Just remember the window of tolerance from the last part of the talk. So all these scanning the body exercises are important because the goal of that exercise in itself is try to scan the body before and after the exercise. Does something change? Are you more in balance? Does the body doesn't ache anymore so much? What are your headaches doing? This is quite a very short overview, just a reminder. With all these exercises we are using all of our senses. The body and its sensory system represents in a way the doorway to calm the mind down. Here are some two very colorful pictures which are emphasizing just that. You have some grounding techniques and you have bodily topics you can check, and you can focus on something else. For example, on the left side, the colorful little picture, try to talk to the survivor after you together did the exercise scanning the body. Is something worrying about there? Is there some anxiety? What are your muscles doing? And then try such a grounding exercise and ask the survivor, find 5 things you see around yourself. And the survivor has to pick 5 things. The door, the window, the book in your shelf, the colorful jacket he or she is wearing. And it's also quite okay if you just challenge the survivor to say aloud these things, not just thinking in the head, but tell you, oh, I see the door, I see the window, I see the wall. And then ask the survivor to find 4 things he or she can touch. That might be the jacket, that might be the computer, that might be a stone you have on your table that the survivor can pick up and take in his hand. And then find 3 things she or he is hearing. Okay, I hear the car driving by, I hear the voice of the helper, I hear a door slamming in the background. Afterwards, the sensory input with smell. Smell is a quite important sensory input, and lots of studies have shown that smell is very, very powerful and a very, very powerful focus point to get the survivor back, sometimes more than the vision or the hearing. So 2 things to smell. Do you smell something in the office? You might ask the survivor. And you might add also something to taste. For example, some survivors would like to work with lemon water. They have a glass with a very strong lemon water solution which tastes very sour. And it's reacting in this way, or it's that the body comes back to the here and now. The green box on the right side is about the same without the taste. But again, it's just use your creativity and work with the survivor with these bodily sensations. This is a very long exercise you will find also in our manual on the webpage of Mental Health and Human Rights Information on page 156, and it's called Grounding the Body. I won't elaborate that here and now. It's very okay to read it by yourself. and to teach it the survivor by reading it out aloud, and the survivor, he or she, can follow your instructions. The key points also here is to get the attention of the survivor to the body. How does it feel when sitting on the chair? How does it feel having the feet on the ground? How does it feel to have the spine against the back of the stool? Another very good exercise is called square breathing. Also here, the instructions you find in the manual we have on our website. And this is just one of many, many breathing exercises you can use when you ask a survivor to breathe in a certain way, to have the focus on in-breathe and out-breathe, maybe also to count or to follow, like here in this exercise, a square. Then also the body calms down. That is a very known connection between breathing and the bodily balance. One has to be a little bit careful when the survivor has been in a very stressful event where he or she had to run to get away from a danger. So maybe very stressful, very fast breathing will be a trigger to get the survivor back in the dangerous situation where she had to flee. So you have to ask and to talk with the survivor before you start with a breathing exercise. But in general, these breathing exercises are very, very useful. Creating a safe place, again, a very long exercise. It takes about 15 minutes if you are working with the survivor through these exercises. You find also the instruction in our manual. Also here the key points are that you try to visualize a place the survivor remembers from the past, from something. It might be a secure spot in the life or just a feeling, and try the survivor to get to relive this good moment. And at the same time, while reliving the good moment, try to calm the body through that. The last little bit longer exercise we have as an example here, I won't teach it explicitly here either, is progressive release of muscular tension. It's a very useful exercise, and in general that means you suggest for the survivor just to tense all the muscles, and you're going through the body, different muscle groups. First, very consciously to tense the muscles, and then very consciously to relax the muscles. And then you suggest seeing the difference. And it's very useful to get the survivor in a balanced state, because they suddenly see, oh, it's possible to relax. Most of them are very tense, and it's very difficult for them to relax. Here are also some good points you can use for the survivor which has sleep problems, sleeping disorder. I was into that topic a little bit before. You get sleep problems because of lots of disturbing things. That might be intrusions, that might be stress, that might be anxiety, or the sleep by itself is disturbed. And here are also some good, useful advices you can try to use. You can try to make the bedroom as safe as possible. Very often it's okay to have a little bit light on that, and it's not pitch black. And you have to prepare for the night. You try to calm yourself down with activities or rituals. Maybe some of the grounding exercises I have mentioned now. It's also very useful to avoid intense activities right before bedtime. Not drinking, not smoking would be a good idea. Sleeping during the day is not okay either, because that will disturb the sleeping pattern of the night. And it's also for survivors very normal, at least, to wake up during the night several times by nightmares. So that is also quite important to teach them that it's a key essential point to be aware of the surroundings as fast as possible when they are awakening from the sleep. That again, maybe they have light in their surroundings, they see that they are in security now, that they are not in the dangerous situation anymore. Maybe writing down the nightmare would help. making a new ending of this story is also allowed and quite useful. Back to the helper. All of these things you have seen in the survivors make also count for you as a helper as well, because you as a helper very for sure will feel sometimes very overwhelmed of the situation. Maybe you are as a helper in a refugee camp, the surroundings by itself, it's strange, it's dangerous maybe for you yourself. You're not sitting in your office at home, but also the histories you will see, you will hear, you have to cope with. And also here it's quite okay that you have to take care of yourself as a helper also first. You have to focus on your own body. When you are getting overwhelmed in a talk with a survivor, you also can change your sitting position. You can change the theme or the activity you are just doing. It's very okay to cooperate with a colleague. To be two in a difficult conversation might be very, very helpful. And you might practice all these grounding exercises I have talked about up to now by yourself. Very okay, it's also the useful conversation with a colleague. It's very okay not to sit alone with all these stories we are getting to hear, with all these trauma reactions, with all the thoughts we have for ourselves. Can we help? Are we useful? Do we make a difference? What is the meaning with all that? And then it's very okay not to sit with their own thoughts and reflections and talk to a colleague about that. Last but not least, you can make your own toolbox for stabilization. So lots of colleagues, me included, we have maybe a bowl with things on our writing desk, on our desk when we are talking with clients. And in this bowl there could be very useful, small, tiny things. Maybe a ball with lots of spikes you can give the survivor in the hand when they are talking about very stressful situations and memories. Just remember the exercises I've talked about where you have to take the body with you. So, for example, giving the survivor, while he or she is talking about something very difficult, something into the hand, it's very okay as a strategy. And when the story is getting too overwhelming, you can ask the survivor, oh, could you describe the ball to me? It's a blue ball, it has spikes, it's very hard or it's warm. And that will get the survivor out of this memory and back to the present. Music can be good to cheer the survivor up, to calm down. Smells, again, I've talked about the importance of smell. Some of the smells we are using are very good at bringing the survivor back into the here and now. For example, peppermint is a very, very good smell. It's very strong sometimes and not everybody likes it, but it's useful. Or lavender is also very often used. Here it's also quite important, just a little digression, what kind of experiences survivor maybe had in the past. Some smells are triggers. For example, in some situations the survivor might be in the presence of a very heavy perfume belonging to the perpetrator. Then this smell would be the worst trigger you can imagine. So also here you have to talk to the survivor before you use these things. Some pictures of places you remember, the survivor remembers, very good places could help having at the walls. So at the end of the day, to put it that, be creative. Only your fantasy sets the limits. You can be creative with everything working through the body with the sensory input. That was a little bit insight about the knowledge and the techniques to cope. And I hope you had some good ideas after that. Thank you very much.